everybody. Welcome back to the Lab Lib Lit Lab. We are talking today about ways to improve your abilities as a reader, things that you can learn, things that you can look for when you're reading your stories and your books, and incidentally, movies, TV shows, so that when you go out there into the world, you can speak more intelligently about the books that you love, maybe impress that person on a blind date, right? Sit down, really kind of talk in detail about the book that you're reading, and I'm sure that whoever's sitting across that table from you is absolutely going to love it and invite me to the wedding. So, today we are talking about structure, right? The famous philosopher, natural scientist, everyman, Aristotle, said that every story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Aristotle, let's be honest, he was wrong about a lot of stuff. But he was not wrong about that, right? Stories need to have a structure, or else they're just kind of a mess. And you know that, right? When you're telling a story to your friends, there's always a structure, right? There's a place where you start your story. There is kind of the climactic moment where you reveal sort of the most interesting part of your story, and then you kind of let us know what happened afterwards, right? So honestly, you're already familiar with story structure. You probably use it every day. I was thinking about it. Mainly, when we talk about structure right now, today, we're talking about structure at the text level, right? I'm not really talking about sentence structure today, but it's how is the story constructed. And as I've said in all of these lessons, this is an authorial choice. The author, in considering how they want to tell their story, has to choose, where do I start? Where do I end? How does this go about? So some examples, right? Do you start with the beginning of the action, right? You start right where the action starts. So, for example, you're telling your story to your friends and you say, bam! We slammed into the wall of the bank. There were bricks and glass everywhere, and people were running, and there was alarms, and it was crazy, right? That's one way to do it. Start right where the action starts. Everybody loves that. Or you could start with sort of more general context, right? Give your listener some sense of what was going on before the story started. So, it was a sunny day. Too sunny, maybe, because as I was driving along, the sun was getting in my eyes, and all the kids screaming in the back didn't help, right? So a little bit of context. Then you get to the bit where you hit the bank. Or maybe you start sort of with the result, right? Begin at the end. Begin with the most important consequence of your story, and then work backwards from there. So maybe, man, thanks for bailing me out. I know it's expensive, but especially on those federal charges, but let me explain. I can explain everything that happened, right? So like I said, you're already familiar with story structure. So none of this should be a surprise, but we're going to go over it so that when you're reading your next book or your next short story even, that you can kind of pause and ask yourself, like, okay, why did the author start here, right? Because the structure that the author chooses will help them create the effect they're trying to create, which in turn will help them kind of send us the message, send us the idea that they're trying to tell us, that we're trying to get. So if you are reading a book and you notice those structural choices, then essentially you are noticing what the author is doing, And it's like any kind of craftsmanship, right? If you are watching one of those DIY channels on how to make a chair, and the person making the chair, the woodworker, explains, I chose this kind of wood and I'm putting together in this fashion, it's for a reason. The same thing is true with stories. So we're talking about the overall macro structure. So when we talk about story structure, the big question that you want to ask yourself is, how are the events presented to me in this story, right? The events of the plot, the A, the B, the C, the D, the E, the this happened, and so this happened, but then this happened, that sort of thing, right? That's what you want to ask yourself. So there's a lot of ways that an author can choose to do it. For example, they can do it in sequence, beginning to end, first to last, right? A lot of very popular stories are written this way because it is the most kind of direct and accessible and least confusing manner that you can do it in, right? When you look at, I keep going back to Harry Potter, but it's very well known. So, but Harry Potter is very sequential, right? Very, very rarely does Rowling kind of go back in time. Very rarely does she require us to read things out of order. It begins at the beginning, and when it gets to the end, it stops, which is really good. It's especially good for children's literature, right? Because children understand a more linear story very well, and they can work up to the more complex story structures as they go. You might have something that is out of sequence, right? Where the story is told perhaps in flashbacks. So, like I said, it might start at the very end, and the storyteller might put pieces in together kind of out of order. And as you are reading, you have to do the job of assembling them in the right order. There was one source I was looking at when I was doing research for this that says very often this is very often seen actually in Holocaust memoirs, where a writer will not necessarily tell their story from the beginning when they were captured to the end when they were released, but they will often sort of order things in terms of emotional impact, right? I've read a few Holocaust memoirs. I've read, of course, Night by Elie Wiesel. I don't know what my voice is doing today, but it's doing something exciting. Night by Elie Wiesel, and If This Is a Man by Primo Levi. And Levi even said when he, in the introduction to his book, that he wrote this out of order. He wanted to write about the most sort of pressing thing first, and then he wrote about the rest. And the sense that you get about life in those camps is that they were very timeless, in a sense, right? You don't know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. Every day is sort of the same. You go out and you do backbreaking, horrifying work, and there is no real sense of time or sequence, with the possible exception of the seasons. So you find a lot of these memoirs might be written out of sequence because it doesn't really matter what happened before what or what happened after what. All that matters to that storyteller is to communicate to us what it was like to exist in one of those places. So you might find some stories like that, if that's what they're trying to tell you. You might have, for example, a framing device in your story. So way back, if you are one of the OGs of this channel, you remember way back we did Frankenstein, right? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was great. A scientist creates a guy, you know the story. And the thing about Frankenstein that I don't often see reflected in, say, the film adaptations, is that Frankenstein had a framing device. The structure of Frankenstein was really, really neat. It begins with letters from this guy, Captain Walton, who's an explorer who is determined to go to the North Pole and discover the passage north and be the first one there. And while he is sailing through this incredibly dangerous environment, he runs into a guy on a dog sled, and he invites him up on the boat, and he helps nurse him back to health. And this guy starts to tell a story, and that is Victor Frankenstein. And so we get our sort of second level in there. And Victor Frankenstein tells his story about himself, where he comes from, who he was, the creation of the creature. And then at a certain point in the story, Victor tells of his meeting with the creature, and the creature tells his story. So Shelley has created this kind of nesting doll structure of stories and narratives in that book, which is really, really neat. And as I'm reading it, that was one of my first questions was, why do this? Why frame it this way? And I think you can come up with a lot of really good reasons, but I think that framing device of Captain Walton's letters, of them on the ship, really helps. Number one, I think it's going for a sense of like verisimilitude, right? These are found letters, as kind of Blair Witch Project-y, if you will. But also it kind of sets boundaries on the story. It says that the story has begun, the story has ended. There is no more after this, and what we are hearing is hopefully the totality of it. And that when we get to the end of the story, when we see the results of it, we do understand there will be no more story to this. So that is a popular way of doing things, is to frame a story within kind of a larger structure in order to maybe give it a bit of context. For example, you might see, for example, choices of point of view, right? Does it have one point of view or many points of view? So again, a lot of books are written, especially if they're written in first person, with one singular point of view. You have a main character, we follow that main character around, and we see what their experience is, and they are the ones leading the story forward. There are other stories with multiple points of view, and I was reading Leviathan Wakes, the first of the Expanse books. One of the things that I really liked is it bounced between these 2 points of view, right? It was Holden and Miller, and kind of bounced between them, and the effect of that, right? Because again, the author did not have to do that. The author could have chosen one or the other and let them drive the story forward. But the effect of that is we are seeing the events that are happening in the belt from two distinctly different perspectives. One kind of an idealist, we must do good at all cost, former military, and the other a member of, a belter, someone who was born and raised in the belt and who's kind of been worn down over time to be more cynical and less trustworthy. We're kind of seeing how these events play out from these 2 points of view. because, they're both good points of view, but they're not the point of view. There's other books, especially when you get into maybe epic fantasy, for example, which have a big ensemble cast. I'm looking at you, Wheel of Time, where the writer will change perspectives in each chapter, right? So if you do read Wheel of Time, and you should, and I should do it here. It's been a while since I've done my reread. But it begins with the point of view of Rand al'Thor, sort of our ostensible main character of the series. And it goes with him until Robert Jordan splits the party. And then he starts to kind of bounce between, here's Rand talking about his journeys with Matt, and then here's, say, Perrin and Egwene, and here's Nynaeve and Lan and Moiraine, right? So bouncing between those. And as the cast gets bigger, as we add more and more characters, Jordan switches up between more and more points of view, and occasionally doing what we saw in Leviathan Wakes, which is giving us different versions of what happened from different perspectives, right? So again, the writer, Jordan in that case, had to make a decision. When he gets to chapter, 15, he has to decide, am I going to change to a new perspective? Whose perspective is it? Where are they in the story? And why does it have to happen now? That's always a big question I like to ask in my book. Why did this have to happen now, right? Why are we going from a Perrin chapter to an Elaine chapter? That's a choice that Jordan had to make. And I think it's worth asking that question as you read. Are you going to come up with any real sort of mind-blowing revelations about the story from that? Maybe. Maybe not. You never know. Well, you won't know till you try. Give it a shot, right? Ask that question. See what you get from it. So you might see some other stuff like where maybe experimental structure, right? Some friends of mine are starting to read The House of Leaves, which I've read once. I'm not really sure if I'm up to reading it again because it's a weird book. And the structure of that book is incredibly strange. It is footnotes within footnotes within footnotes. It is very discursive. It is incredibly kind of non-linear and often rather hard to follow. It is experimental. You can see the structure on the page itself is a thing where sometimes you have to kind of turn it in a spiral to read it, or there's just one word. And the reason for that being is that the author of that book wanted that book to be a weird experience, because that's what the book is describing, is a kind of weird. And by weird, I don't mean like, J.D. Vance weird. I mean like Lovecraft weird, right? Like the world is an unusual and unknowable place weird, right? Classic stuff. So yeah, by looking at the structure that the author has chosen, you can discern a bit about what kind of story they're trying to tell and why they're trying to tell it that way. There might be information that they will need you to know ahead of time in order for the rest of it to make sense. There might be information that they're hiding from you that they don't want you to have just yet, because if you get this information, then maybe all the tension kind of flows out of the narrative that they're telling, right? So these are very, very deliberate choices. And I think when you're reading, it is worth stopping, pausing, and asking, why is it built this way? So there could be a whole other video based on like classic sort of structural skeletons. So the classic structure, for example, got my notebook. Classic structure is you got your exposition, right, where everything is introduced to us. We have what's called the rising action, where the tension begins to rise. Things start to happen. The main characters are doing stuff, and it's not succeeding just yet. Then you have the climax, which is the point of highest tension, where the characters have tried everything they're going to try, and this is the point where they either succeed or they fail, and that's it. Then there is the falling action, where things start to get, there's like the aftermath of the climax, and then of course the resolution, where things are tied up, and the story is formally closed out. But that is not the only structure. There's lots of other ones. You've got, for example, the 3-act structure. You've got the hero's journey. You've got what's known as the Fichtean curve, the 7-point structure, the Freytag's pyramid, the Save the Cat structure. There's a lot of different named and sort of formal structures, which if you're really interested in, you can go look. I'll put some links in the description for them so that you can start to get a sense of what these structures are. And if you are an aspiring writer, this is also good for you too. So yeah, if you want to look at the structure of your story and ask why it's done that way, I do think that will help you out a lot. I think that will help you better understand the story that you are reading and better understand the story, the thing that the author is trying to communicate, right? Life is like this. That's sort of our through line of all of these videos. Life is like this. So that's basically a basic rundown on structure in a story or in a novel. And I think the most important thing that you need to take away, as I said at the beginning, is that this is deliberate. The author has made very deliberate choices about how the story is going to be told. And it is, I think, worthwhile for us as readers to pay attention to that and to ask ourselves, why? And why is this structure the best way to tell this story? What would we lose if the author decided to go another way, right? For example, when we talk about splitting the party with Wheel of Time, right? I just remembered Lord of the Rings. So in Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship splits. We get Sam and Frodo go off their way. Everybody else goes off their way. Merry and Pippin get kidnapped. And you note that Tolkien does not do what a lot of modern fantasy authors do, which is to interleave the stories. You don't have Aragorn and Boromir chapter and then Sam and Frodo and then Aragorn and Boromir. You won't have that. Tolkien has a whole first book with one group. It's been a while since I read it, so I can't remember which one comes first, so I'm not going to do it because you'll yell at me. But they have one section with one group, and then sort of resolve that in the second half of the book is with the other group. And eventually he'll bring them back together. But again, that's a choice that Tolkien made. And why? Maybe to highlight the isolation between these two groups, that there really is no connection between them. They are completely separated from each other. So to interleave their points of view would kind of imply that there is still a connection between their stories in a sense, but except in a very fundamental way, trying to stop Sauron and destroy the ring, those two groups are separate, right, and distinct and can't help each other. So what are some other ones? We have circular storytelling. We have, as I said, nonlinear storytelling, interactive storytelling, and interactive structure. We see that in Choose Your Own Adventure books. Remember those when you were a kid? You loved those, didn't you? Did you ever hold your place in a Choose Your Own Adventure book? And then you go to the one you chose and you go, oh, that's no good. And you have to go back to your place and choose the other one. I did that all the time. I'm a cheater. But that kind of gets us to video games, right? I strongly believe video games are a great vessel for good stories. And video games are an interactive storyline. And the better video games, like your Disco Elysium, for example, or your Baldur's Gate 3, the story is not going to be the same depending on the choices that you make. So anyway, those are my thoughts on story structure. If you have thoughts on story structure and how it works and why it's important and what you've learned about it in your reading, please put it in the comments. I would love to hear from you. This is always best if it's interactive. I hope this gives you something to think about the next time you read your story or your book. And thank you for coming to class. I will see you in the next Lit Lab video, all right? Stay well, everybody.